Hello, everyone. Hopefully the sound is picking up on this. I will always check before I post these, but we are recording chapter 9, so I've finished the recordings for 7, 8, and 9. Remember that every single unit that we do in humanities is 3 chapters. So we had unit 1 was chapters 1 through 3, unit 2 was chapters 4 through 6, Unit 3 is chapters 7, 8, and 9, and then we'll have one more unit, and that's 10, 11, and 12. So we don't have any chapters after 12. That's all that there are in there. So we have 4 units total. And so once we wrap up chapter 9, that's when we open up the next test. So just keep that in mind, that as we finish chapter 9, I'll have the test ready and open, and then you will take that test as we kind of move on into the next unit. So just know that this one's rounding out the other 2. Now, the other thing to remember for this particular chapter is it's not that, I mean, it's a radically different subject matter than what we've covered so far in the Italian Renaissance and then the Renaissance in the North, but it happened at about the same time, and that's why we're covering all of this. In Elizabethan England, for instance, when Queen Elizabeth was queen, well, that included, a bunch of explorers who went over, and for instance, one of her big suitors and certainly one of her major courtiers led the expedition to Roanoke, Virginia, and that's a lost colony. Literally, he came back for supplies, and when he got back to Roanoke, it was deserted. We don't know what happened to the people in Roanoke, but those expeditions were happening at the very end of the 16th century. And so pretty much the Renaissance, at least the Northern Renaissance, is cut in half right about 1600. And so Jamestown will be established in 1607 in Virginia. And so a lot of what happens in what they called the New World in the Americas will happen on the tail end of all of this. Now, our focus, though, is not going to be so much on what the Europeans are doing or what they thought. It's much more on the effect that the Europeans are having. So for the last several chapters, we've been kind of stuck in Europe. Really, for the last 4 chapters, we've been stuck in Europe. Now we're moving out because Europeans and European countries are looking to establish, and expand their reach. And so we are looking at the countries and the populations that they affected. And that's what this chapter is pretty much going to go on. There's no glorification of things. And if you haven't noticed this already from our past chapters, this will be one where we kind of talk about things as truly as possible. It's not about commemorating Christopher Columbus or anything like that. It's about looking at what exactly happened and what were the effects on the populations where they went. And that includes not only the Americas, North and South America, but it includes Australia, it includes Africa to a great extent, and it includes the East. For the explorers even went so far as China and Japan, mostly in that case, though, for trade, though they did establish colonies and they did absolutely take control over certain islands and certain populations. So especially in India, that's probably in the East, that's probably the country that was most harmed by European control. But we're going to talk about all of these different aspects as quickly as we can. And I will sometimes flip back to the paper, to the chapter, in case I need a map or something that's not on this particular calendar. So just know that I'm going to be trying to flip a little bit back and forth, but hopefully this will clarify anything that's in the chapter. That's always my goal with lecture. Okay, so remember when we talked about the Crusades, and I said, well, what really made the Crusades happen? And there was some religious reason, that the Christians in Europe wanted to get Jerusalem back, and the Pope kind of added to that by saying if you died in the Crusades, you go to heaven and stuff like that. Well, the truth is, at this point with exploration, there were a number of reasons why Europeans suddenly wanted to explore. First of all, they had more of the technology from China. Like, for instance, rudders. The ship's rudder was invented in China in about the 1st century, and yet it didn't reach Europe until many centuries later. There were many things that China invented that only reached, even for navigation, like the compass. that the Chinese had for centuries and centuries before they ever reached Europe. Well, with all of these extra technologies, they had the capability to go farther, to travel not just along a coast of something, but to really venture out into an ocean. They also, one thing I do want to make sure I quell is the vast majority of the population at this time they were not flat earthers. So there were probably no more flat earthers back then in Columbus's time than there are now. And our population is, of course, higher, but most people knew that the earth was round. So there wasn't that they weren't fearful of things, dropping off the edge of the ocean or something like that. That's actually myth. That's not something that the general population believed. They absolutely believed it was round. And Columbus actually, he just kind of misjudged how big the earth was, the measurement of the earth and how long it would take to travel a great distance. He just thought there was one ocean essentially over on the essentially between the East and Europe. So he thought he was going to go to do a straight shot across the ocean and get to China and India. And he was going to try to go around the back way. So it's not that he thought the earth was, or he was trying to dispel the myth that the earth was flat. He, like most other people, thought the earth was round, but he didn't know that the Americas existed. And neither did most people. So, but they did. It's not like they popped up out of the ocean just in time for Europeans to discover them. Populations had lived on those continents for, of course, centuries. We don't know exactly how they got across. There, some, for so long there was speculation that they had a sort of land bridge from Siberia over to Alaska and came that way. But honestly, most of that's been dispelled because when human populations were alive, there was no like major ice age. And so they wouldn't have had the access. Instead, the lingering theory at this point, we really don't know. It's going to be an I don't know because we don't know the answer. But most theorists agree that it's most likely to have been travel from very early travel from China. And that we know that the Chinese government had a massive navy at one point, and then the navy was almost systemically disbanded. And we don't know exactly why. We don't have documents that record why. We just know that at one point an emperor said, let's get rid of the navy, and they destroyed the boats and stuff. But until that time, we know they did exploration. And genetically, there is far more similarity between Chinese population, the Asian genes and Native American genes. We also know too, genetically, that the most genetic variety occurs in the earliest genetic populations. And where does the most genetic variety occur? In Africa. It gets a little less varied as it goes into Europe. Then it kind of travels eastward through Asia. And then the least differentiated genetic material is to be found in Native American populations, both in North and South America. And so that would suggest that these places were populated last and by a more limited set of genetic material. And so that's how we kind of figure all of this out. But the truth is we still don't know why or how. We just know that it likely Native Americans actually came from the East. And we know that like in Polynesia, the islands in the Pacific, they are very similar. They have a lot of the same genetic dispositions as the Native Americans in North and South America. So this would also suggest the same. So anyway, that's just all speculation, sort of, but it is based on scientific study and especially on genetic material. Okay, other things. We know that in Europe, and of course, they didn't have any understanding that there was but they definitely wanted trade, and trade across the land to China on the Silk Road was very long. I mean, it took forever. And sometimes, I mean, literally months to get one load of something over that way and then to get the load back, to get any results. It could be 6 months, even by they were hoping, of course, to find some way of essentially getting past Turkey and going by sea through the Indian Ocean. But they tried traversing around Africa, to find a faster way. And that's one reason why Christopher Columbus said, well, let's just go a straight shot west and see. And he was really hoping to run into Asia that way. So, but the truth is they wanted those materials. They wanted textiles. They wanted trade with China. They wanted a lot of these. The middle class and upper middle class were growing, so they had more demand for these kinds of stuff. And so if they could find a faster way there, then they wanted to do that. The other thing is that they were running out of materials. They did, they chopped almost all of their trees down in Europe. They used up almost all of their, the coal reserves and everything else, the stuff that they were beginning to use, especially that would lead into that they would need for the industrial age to come, which you're going to find in chapter 11 and 12. So they needed more resources, and that included wood. And so where were they going to get it? Where were they going to live? As it is, they were getting more and more crowded. And, if everybody owned the land already, it wasn't really easy to go buy land of your own. So where can you go? Well, of course, that's exactly what happened is, in the Americas especially, people would move over there because they could go and get land, and they could have access to land that they would never have access to in Europe if they stayed in the country of their origin. And so certainly that was going to be a reason as well. Now, eventually, especially under Catholicism, there's going to be a movement towards, Christianizing much of the world. But that's going to come later. We're going to talk about it at least to some degree when we get to Mexico and South America, but especially to Mexico and southern, what is now the southern United States, like Arizona and New Mexico. But we'll try to show kind of what they did in each case and what the effect of everything was. Now, there were positive effects. I don't want to, this is not all a downer chapter, but it is sort of a downer chapter. But there were positive things that came out of that. First of all, yes, they did get access to a lot of really amazing natural resources. There was a tremendous exchange of ideas. There was wealth that the Europeans got from all of this. And we had much more accurate maps. This is literally, you can see the map below, but there are other examples in the chapter. This is a map that this is all they had. I mean, they knew pretty much the coast of Africa over on the right-hand side, but they had no idea what was in the rest of the world because all they could see, even in early exploration, all they got to was the eastern side of North and South America. So they had a really good understanding of where Florida was, but they really didn't know the rest, what was to be found in the rest of the world because they hadn't gone that far. Even India's description, over on the side, the very, very, very far right, India looks nothing like actual India. So the maps are going to get more and more accurate. Let me go ahead and switch to just a little over to these maps. And you can see that just in, here's the very limited, we have like the Mediterranean or something, but we really don't have anything beyond that. And yet a new detailed map, and this is hard to see, I think, but you at least over on the on the left-hand side, you see a gigantic North America, rather misrepresented South America. It doesn't really look like the actual country, but then a much more accurate Africa and India and the East. And so this is in 1569. So this is before the end of the 16th century. And yet it's so much more accurate than it was. It even has, major estuaries that are to be found on some of these coastlines. And that's because of this added travel. Before then, we did not know, it was hard to tell distance, and we had not explored much of any of these other places. And so they had a very good, clear view of the Mediterranean, but we had a very unclear view of the rest of the world. And so that is what is really changed. And so that was a positive too. All good, except it's not all good. The vast majority of the negative, and there are tremendous negative effects. So it's not like a great thing that Christopher Columbus, did what he did. It happened. And yet, because of the way it happened, and especially because of certain populations' vulnerability to disease, it had a devastating effect on most of the populations that were explored. And so that's what I really want you to understand is it's not just Native Americans like in North and South America, it's also the Polynesian islands, the native populations there, and it's also some of the Asian populations. And there was also, I mean, it not because of disease, but a devastating effect that would be centuries long on Africans living in Africa because of slavery. So we're going to cover all of this stuff. So, you know, I wanted to get the positive things out of the way. Yes, the Europeans did gain a lot from this, but the truth is it's just like what we're going to talk about when we get to the industrial age. There are people who really benefit, and there are a lot of people who really suffer because of it too. Although in this case, the suffering far outweighs the positives. So yes, Europeans did benefit greatly, especially in wealth. They gained a lot, but at the expense of the lives and the futures of many of these native populations. And that includes several different continents. So I just want you to keep that in mind. I'm not going to brush it along either. So I'm going to be pretty real because I want you to understand exactly what has created, in some ways too, it's the source of much of the racial divide that still exists here in the United States. There's resentment, lingering resentment over the misuse of populations, and there's resentment, there's still lingering prejudice that comes from this Eurocentric view that will come over with the Mayflower and with Christopher Columbus's Nina Pinta and Santa Maria. So the truth is disease was number one. It killed there. We don't know, we don't have census information, just like we don't know exactly how many people died in the Crusades, but we know that, I mean, the estimates are that somewhere between 75 and 90% of the Native Americans in North and South America died within 100 years, just 100 years of the first landings. Not Leif Erikson's, because way up in north, because he only met briefly and then left, but with the onset of, like, for instance, Christopher Columbus's voyages, within 100 years, 90% of the Native American populations in both continents were dead. So entire tribes disappeared. They died out. Much of that was because of disease, but it was also because they were enslaved. And not only did that mean that they were treated badly, but it also meant that they were subject to constant contact, physical contact with Europeans, which made the passing of disease far more likely. But there was also an effort that was made, and we're going to talk about a little bit of that, you know, how the people who, the Europeans did not exactly care if the natives died of their diseases. And they even sometimes fostered that transmission of disease. But the truth is there was also outright violence towards whole tribes. And we do have explorers, especially the conquistadors of Spain and Portugal, who essentially decimated entire tribes, killing every single person within them. So that kind of stuff happened too. And it's not good. It's sort of the same concept behind the Crusades as well. You know, that these populations, because they worship differently, because they live differently, have a different culture, or their skin color is different, then it's okay to kill them. It's okay to use violence against them. It's okay to be horrific in one's treatment of them. And so that's going to still, unfortunately, you know, we have still threads of that level of prejudice that don't just exist in the United States, but exist in the Caribbean, in South America, in the islands, in the Pacific, in Australia, and they're dealing with that too. The indigenous tribes in Australia are trying to get, you know, to I guess have returned to them many of the rights that were stripped of them when England took over Australia. So it's a continuous effort to kind of shift the lines back because they were thrown way out of whack when all of this stuff happened. So some of it was because Europeans believed that their Christian roots and their Christian ties made them superior. And so they tried to essentially not proselytized, but they tried to get these pagan worshipers, or these, definitely these people were not Christian. They had never encountered Christianity, but they felt that the effort, it was worth violence. It was okay to resort to violence to get people to switch to Christianity. But in the process, many of these populations, and Canada is dealing with this right now. They have many schools that were schools for natives and for First Nation. That's what they call the Native Americans. But these First Nation children were taken by force to these schools, and many of them were killed. They were lived in horrific conditions, were abused in every way, shape, and form, and many of them starved to death, were beaten to death, or died of disease because of neglect. And so, and there are hidden, literally, they have found hidden graveyards outside many of these old schools, most of which were closed sometime in the 20th century, but that's not early enough for many people. And there are still people living who suffered within those schools, who can tell you exactly how they were run and what happened to them while they were there, and even of friends that they lost while they were there, other students. So, the loss of language, the loss of culture, the loss of life, all of this was happening simultaneously. So we're going to deal with some of those things. And most of it happened because the Europeans saw themselves as so eminently superior. So those ideas that, for instance, that Hitler would expand upon, the idea of this Aryan race, this perfect race, and we have to weed out the people who aren't perfect. That stems from Eurocentrism. That stems from that same idea that the European skin color, the European hair color, the European way of life, the European faith, the European culture and style of dress, all of those things were superior to any other culture in the world. And so that would affect, because the Europeans did have warfare that was pretty advanced, they had technologies that most of the native populations would not have. And that's when it would make it very easy for them to quell any sort of upheaval, any sort of resistance against them militarily. Okay, so let's talk about Christopher Columbus. And just so you guys know, I'm being totally honest with you, I am not a fan of Columbus Day, mainly because Christopher Columbus never set foot in the United States, ever. He found Cuba and the West Indies and a few other Caribbean islands, but he never discovered any part of what is now the United States of America. Never. And Jamaica is part of the United States, and he did not discover Jamaica. So the whole idea of him discovering the United States is just, first of all, ridiculous. But it also negates the fact that there were populations living here already. So they were Americans. They were living in North America or South America, but they were living here already and had been for centuries and centuries and centuries. They didn't have a written language, however, so they didn't have, at least most of them didn't. The Mayans are an exception, but they did. They still existed. They still had a culture. They still have stories. Many of you are talking about wanting to study the folklore or mythology of Native Americans for your topics for papers. Great, you go for it, because they have a wealth of history, of medicine, of mythology, of folklore. They have a definite culture and definite languages, even if those languages are not written down. But Christopher Columbus, why did he come? More than anything else, he wanted to trade. He wanted to make his fortune. He wanted to trade with India, and that's what he was hoping. That's why he calls the Native Americans Indians. And for so many years, that is what they have been called. And if not Indians outright, they've been called American Indians. But the truth is they have nothing to do with India. So I usually use the term Native Americans or natives. But I'll say, some people call them indigenous populations. The truth is, a lot of different tribes or different tribal members today call themselves by all sorts of things. Some of them call themselves American Indians. There's a Society for the American Indian. There's also a Native American Consortium. So they may identify themselves more by their tribe than by Native American as a title. And the truth is, too, even when I talk about Native Americans here, I can't, just like talking about the Greeks, if you talk about an Athenian, someone who lived in Athens, it was different than someone who lived in Sparta. They very rarely got along with each other, but they shared the same language. In this case, these populations rarely even share the same language. So they do often communicate with each other. So there are some commonalities, and yet they each have their distinctive tribal community. And that's something to keep in mind. Same with Africa. That happened as well. Each tribe in Africa had its own set of, not only linguistic differences, but it also had its own culture and its own stories and its own beliefs. And so, and these were kept often within the tribe. So you can't just talk about Africans this way and Native Americans this way. So I want you to keep that in mind as I talk about different stories. So I'm going to give you some examples that are from specific tribes, especially the big three, the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Mayans, because those are the ones who have probably the most widespread stories. And yet the smaller tribes had different exchanges too, and you'll find out at least a few of them, especially in Mexico when we finish this. But the main thing is he came for wealth. He came not to help out anybody, but to use the system. He wanted natural resources. He wanted gold. He wanted trade, and he wanted to make his fortune. He did not. He died in jail, actually, and he amassed a little bit of wealth. He wrote back lavish letters to the king and queen of Spain, but he did not make a lot of money. And because he came for something that wasn't here, that didn't exist. And that's something to remember. He did also take the very first slaves. So he was the first to start slavery in the Americas. He actually, most of the slaves that he kidnapped, that he took by force and removed, sometimes took all the way back to Europe, were Arawak. That's the first tribe he encountered, and they had tribal communities over many of the islands in Hispaniola, what he called Hispaniola. And so he took many members of that. At first, he kidnapped them so that they could learn his language, and so that they could help translate. But then he took many back all the way back to to Europe. But besides that, by the time, given not only the violence that he did against the Arawak tribes, also the exposure to disease, but between them all, literally the Arawak tribe alone went from millions of a population to completely not existing. There were no members of the Arawak tribe by 1555. So 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and he comes to Hispaniola and the Bahamas and Cuba. And less than 60 years later, well, about a little over 60 years later, that entire tribe is gone, utterly gone. There's no like even 200-person Arawak tribe today. They don't exist anymore. And much of it is probably through disease. So it's not his fault. He didn't know he was bringing smallpox and chickenpox and other diseases that were going to kill the natives. In fact, the only diseases that the natives shared with the Europeans, that they had already had some become accustomed to in some way, is the Native Americans did actually have types of syphilis and other venereal diseases. Not enough to, they didn't kill them, but they did have, those were diseases they actually had. The vast majority of European diseases, though, they had never been exposed to. And I don't know if any of you have had chickenpox. Now they have a shot. I had chickenpox before there was ever a shot for it. But if you don't get chickenpox as a child, it can kill you as an adult. And so what happened to these populations that had no resistance against these diseases? Well, they would die. Whole tribes would die from these kinds of diseases. Now, that's not what Columbus set out to do. He was not setting out to kill people. So in that, it's not like he's a bad dude. He had a very European sensibility. He definitely thought Europeans superior. His writings are disturbing, his letters. Whenever we read them in world literature or in American literature, a lot of students are very much disturbed by the way he saw natives. He saw them as children, simpletons, unable to learn languages, unable to follow any moral code, certainly not Christian, and it was very disparaging of them, almost like he felt that they were little more than animals, and so even if they were cute, like as pets. So his language, the language that he uses, and that a lot of these people used, is quite disturbing to us today. Hernan Cortez, is probably, I mean, well, he's definitely more violent in his treatment, but he actually traveled all the way to Mexico City. He did travel to Cuba after quite a while after Columbus did, but he was a conquistador. So it's not an explorer, it's a conqueror. That's what conquistador means. So they were not out to see what everybody saw and, get technology or it wasn't so much trade as conquering. And that was his goal. That was many of the explorers that we're going to look at aren't really explorers, they're conquistadors. Their primary intent is to take land for their country, claim it, and take it by force. And so that's exactly what Cortez does. In Tenochtitlan, which is now Mexico City, that's essentially the headquarters of the Aztecs, where the Aztecs were one of the biggest tribes and of the Native Americans in both North and South America. They also had kind of a cryptic pictogram, rather similar to the pictograms that were used by ancient Egyptians. And they had their own architecture. They did actually build some pyramids. And their city, Tenochtitlan, which is now Mexico City, was beautiful. And it was very well laid out. And the king had very good control of his people. They were a happy group for the most part. But they believed in many ancient prophecies, they were a very religious group, and the ancient prophecies told them that a white God was going to come, and he was going to save them all and essentially make them prosperous and everything else. And so they when they saw Cortez and saw the soldiers with him, they were like, oh my gosh, this is the white God. They actually believed that he was their savior and he was going to come, and they lavished gifts on him and fed him and essentially did all sorts of, they did what they could to, please him. And for a long time, for a while, Cortez is just, oh yes, thank you for the gifts, yes, acted like an ambassador from Spain. But very quickly after that, once he knew he could, once he had amassed enough of his troops together to attack, he essentially not only captured and killed Montezuma, the emperor of the Aztecs, but he killed most of the men in the Aztec tribes. They raped many of the women. I mean, their attack was savage. And then they took the holy city of Tenochtitlan and they turned it into Mexico City. They razed many of the structures and then built on top of where they had been. So their church that they built was on top of the temple for the Aztecs. So they kind of took over their city and scraped it off and then built anew in the Spanish style. And so they effectively destroyed any power that the Aztecs had. Even though the Aztecs had come to them as friends, they betrayed them and destroyed them. So it's not a good thing. And I certainly don't condone it, but that was the typical conquistador way of doing things. The other thing they did do, and it's something the Spanish and Portuguese were different from many of the other groups. A lot of these exploring groups would build Jamestown, but they really didn't. They might share things with the natives, but they didn't really like intermarry. But the exceptions are a lot of the French trappers who will end up trapping furs pretty much along the St. Lawrence River up in the north, that separates Canada from the United States. They would marry a lot of native women because they'd spend years and years there, sometimes all their lives, and then they just ship furs back, to make money. Well, a lot of the Spanish did the same thing. So many of these soldiers were career soldiers, so they would end up being in Mexico and the North and South, and South America and Central America for decades. And so they typically married natives, and they'd have kids. And so most of the populations of Mexico and Central and South America are very mixed, European and native, because there was so much intermarrying there. That did not tend to happen when we get to the idea of the New England colonies and things like that. Puritans didn't come over and intermarry a whole lot with Native Americans, mainly because Native Americans were not Christian. So, but part of what the Spanish did when they were conquistadors is those that they didn't kill, they wanted to convert to Catholicism. And that became like their missionary mission. They weren't just, it's kind of like the Crusades, they're not just trying to get wealth, they're trying to convert all these populations so that they can save all these heathens' souls. So a lot of it was rebuilding. They would tear down native structures and they build up the other ones. And Coronado actually continued this. You've probably heard of Coronado. There's also, and we'll get to the Incas, and they're when we get to South America, but there were many different conquistadors who all they kind of followed the same sort of roadmap. That you come in, pretend to befriend, then attack and kill a bunch of people, and then quell the rest of them, and then take over. One thing that the Catholic conversion resorted to is they would actually go into different Pueblo communities and just say, from now on, you're not speaking your language. You're not, all of your idols, all of the little, altars that you may have, or the different gods that you may worship, they're all dead. You were only to worship this. It was required. So all the native dances were forbidden. The masks were forbidden. Their language was often forbidden. They weren't allowed to mention any of their gods. What happened though, and this only happened in one section, it's actually kind of equivalent to, a lot of the population lives in northwestern Mexico. And then those populations all spread all the way up north into what is now New Mexico and Arizona. Well, these populations, they call themselves the Pueblo people because that's the area of it's all called the Pueblo. Very much, mostly desert. But and most of these populations are nomadic, so they wandered here and there. They had temporary shelters, and then they'd move following food. So they were kind of Stone Age populations, really. But what the natives did is they waited. There was a Catholic holiday coming up when all the priests would be worshiping together, and the natives attacked Spanish holdings with all these priests. They killed over 400 Spanish soldiers and priests, and then they retreated back to the Pueblo. And from that point on, the Spanish no longer specifically targeted any of those populations. So they were left alone at a time when many of the other populations were still being essentially absorbed into Spanish culture by force. So the Pueblo peoples, there's so many different tribes that this talks about, that this deals with, but it includes, several that are pretty common for us. And that includes, there are several different Navajo tribes that are part of the community still in Arizona and New Mexico. And the Hopi have always been linked with with the Navajo. So, and they share some stories, but they also share this history. So, and these populations still today prefer to be able to retain all of what they, as much of their culture as possible. And they call, for a long time they weren't called the Pueblo people, which is what they call themselves. The Navajo actually call themselves, and there are these other connected tribes, the Dine. It's just Dine, but it just means we're the people. That's all it means. And they just denote themselves as we're us. Kind of, it's like calling the earth instead of by a name. Well, any population living on an earth would want to call it, it's ours. It's the earth, and then there's all these other places. Well, that's it. They're the people. But they have still to this day retained much of their oral storytelling and a lot of their ritual dance. Now, there are links. You can see links. You can look that up and look up some of their ritual dances. I know that they're described in the chapter as well. So, but the truth is much of what they are is not necessarily open for human consumption. So there are some public things that not only the Diné, but some of the other Pueblo peoples do, and some of the Northwestern tribes and First Nation tribes in Canada do. But a lot of what they do, or a lot of what they find sacred, they don't necessarily make public. So it's not like they're keeping things secret, but it's not just for show. It really is part of their culture. And so there are parts of their culture that they don't necessarily express to us. They're more willing than they might to express these stories and everything, because so many people today are willing to, they want to know what their culture really is like. So there's an openness to it, that and an interest in it, that I think helps them retain their culture in a way that they might not have before. So, but they definitely have, we have a lot of artifacts. We even have buildings that they built, as you can see by the photo here on this slide, on slide 8. These are buildings that were built, these are probably the oldest buildings we have, that were built here in the United States, or here in Mexico, or North or South America. So there are pyramids in Central and South America that are very common. Belize has a lot of them. El Salvador does too. Costa Rica, that are, either Mayan or Aztec in origin, but those still exist and are still often in really good shape. And the same goes for these. Now, a lot of these would have had, they might have had wooden roofs, but those have deteriorated, of course, over time. But one thing I want you to notice is that the doors are really high up in the buildings. And the reason they are is for protection. So you didn't just walk in a door. First of all, you would keep all the creatures out, foxes and coyotes and stuff like that. But you also kept intruders out. So if you were in for the night and you were going to go to bed, you just take, instead of locking the door, because there's no door, you just take a long ladder that you use to climb up, and you just pull it inside the house. And so there's no way to get in, and you're safe inside from attack until morning, when you can put the ladder back down. So it's, I mean, they're beautiful. They're really cool to wander around in, honestly. I haven't been to this particular one here, but there are several in Arizona that I was able to walk through, and they're smaller than you'd think. They're meant for shorter people than we are, but they're really beautifully made. And because of the way they're made, and because they exist where they were built is a very dry climate, they've managed to survive for centuries and centuries without really deteriorating. So most of them, you can see people walking around in that photo. That's exactly, they allow, as long as it's safe, they allow people to walk through. Notice how there are no ladders, though. They don't want people climbing up into the buildings and falling off a ladder or something. So, but you can find these in some state parks. You just have to, pay for entry, and you can go and wander in a lot of these ruins. So it's pretty, and there are some that are more ruined than others, but that you can get at least an example of how they lived. They definitely had pottery, and they definitely made baskets. They wove fabric. They had a lot of textiles, but they still primarily used stone tools. And that's something to remember. So they're still technically, because they don't have a written language and because they don't use metal tools, they still technically Stone Age. So keep that in mind as well. Now, what's funny is, or I guess what's interesting, is when Spain comes over, at first what they want to do is create, this is what Tenochtitlan probably looked like. At least it's a little wooden model of it anyway. The pyramid systems you can see and everything. Well, they tore down almost all of this, but they used the flattened platforms essentially to build up their new stuff. What they did find, though, is because so many of the workers they had were native, and Native Americans would be hired as craftsmen, but their techniques were also central to the native population. So, and their building materials also, they couldn't just ship a bunch of stuff from Spain. And so instead they would build using the materials of this area. And so many of the churches at this time, though they wanted to build them in the Spanish style, many of the buildings were in sort of in the Spanish style, but with materials that were very typical, and building techniques that were very typical of the native population. And so we get the first, and I'll show you, this is more of the idea of, old Spain. You can see the Gothic architecture. You can see the use of the domes, but the materials, I mean, I know you haven't seen a church that's this white. This is not made of marble. These are local materials. So a lot of things were made of sandstone, of limestone, of what's the trying to think, it's very much a layered, that was definitely native slate. And yet these would this was at the very beginning. So they did use some things that they would transport, but the vast majority of what they had to build with was going to look very much it's going to match the native architecture because of what they had to build it out of. They just didn't, I mean, they didn't have the means for bringing all of the resources back from Europe. They just didn't. And so most mission churches, these are the smaller churches that were being built all along the roads. So as they take over one, community, and then the next community and the next community, they build a road that went through, and then they build a smaller church in each of these communities. And you'll notice that this one is, I mean, it almost looks like modern architecture, but it's very simple. So there's a simple square door. There's no real windows except for that one. And then up in the top, that little opening there on slide 9 and 11 is where the bell tower would be. And so they might ship the bell over from somewhere else. And yet the vast majority of all the building itself was made of adobe. That was far more common because that's what the buildings in that area were built of anyway. That's what the builders knew how to do. And they had a lot of access to clay and stone and things like that. So they knew how to create the adobe exterior. Problem is that adobe doesn't last very long. So mostly they have to keep doing more upkeep. It's kind of like there's a mosque in Northern Africa that's made of sand, and they have to redo it like every year. They have to build the walls up again and stuff because it just slowly wears away. Well, the adobe kind of does the same thing. Most of the adobe we do today is pretend. It's not really adobe. It's actually cement, some type of concrete that is fashioned to look like an adobe house and then painted. But the most adobe was not painted. It was the color of the dirt that was used. And so if you had red sand, like this church in particular, you can see the rocks are, the adobe is very red. Well, that's because of what sand they used. And then the rocks in front and on the sides that kind of hold up the walls, those rocks are just native. Those are going to be rocks that they found locally. So you'll notice that there is no Roman arch, there's no dome, I mean, it doesn't really look Spanish in style at all, mainly because the builders didn't know how to emulate that style using the materials they had. And so that would change. The architecture is going to be quite unique. It's not going to look quite native because it's going to try to be reflecting the more, the Spanish and Portuguese, past and their style of architecture, but it simply can't. It can't look like the traditional Spanish Baroque style or even medieval style because they just don't have the resources for it. Okay, now let's get to the Incas. This is probably of all of them, of all of the 3 stories. And the Mayans were slowly disappeared once explorers came in and took over. But this is by far the most violent of all. I mean, and it even tops Cortes and his treatment of the Aztecs. Pizarro was, by all accounts, an absolutely horrifically mean man. He was a bad dude. He was violent. He was angry. He was selfish. He was jealous. He was, bad to his own, colleagues. And he definitely was willing to fight for his spot. Like he wanted to really make a name for himself. And he was willing to do that even through violence, if that's what it took to do that. So Pizarro was, I mean, it's pretty well accounted, what exactly happened, what Pizarro did, what Atahualpa did. But the Incas were living in Peru. So if you look at South America, Peru is over on the western side of it. And Peru is very mountainous region. And if you go to see, like for instance, you can go and see the Peruvian, it's actually on my list of my bucket list where I want to go. The Machu Picchu, the city up on ruins up on the top of one of these massive hills. Well, these are the Andes Mountains, so they're very high, very steep, and very numerous. Well, he wanted, of course, he wanted to take over and essentially eradicate the Incas. That was his goal, Pizarro's goal. But he tried to go about it essentially through subterfuge. So he invited Atahualpa, the king of the Incas, to a feast. Atahualpa, thinking that his population was way too numerous, he had too many well-trained soldiers, he was too wealthy, he was too, had too much influence, whatever it was that gave him this false pride. He really thought he was not in any danger when he came to this dinner. It's sort of like, Julius Caesar going into the Senate, the Roman Senate, thinking they were going to make him Caesar, and they slaughtered him instead. Well, this kind of is what happened. But Atahualpa was, he came unarmed. He was told to, it's bad manners to come with arms. So he came unarmed, but with many of his men, all of whom were captured. And in fact, where is it? The picture, the painting right here that's depicted right here on slide 4 is Atahualpa climbing up a rock, actually, to get away from Pizarro and his soldiers. But he was captured. Let me go back where we were. It's a cool painting, but it does show that kind of fear, I guess. So Pizarro captures Atahualpa and his men, and he at first starts to torture him and says, okay, the only way I'm going to let you out, first of all, of prison and let you be king again is if you accept Christianity. So of course there's that, I'm doing this for religious reasons to make it so that you go to heaven eventually. The king says no. He refuses. Well, why should I accept? First of all, you've captured me. This is all by force. Why should I accept that if I don't, if I don't accept, why would I do that by force? So he refuses. And Pizarro and his men essentially slaughter thousands of the Inca tribe. And Atahualpa is captured. And when he is captured, he says, look, I have a lot of wealth. You can have the wealth if you let me go. So this is after tons and tons of his people have been slaughtered. Okay. And Atahualpa, at first, Pizarro says, sure, okay, give me 24 tons of gold. And that's what he gets. So it's a lot of gold. And the Incas were actually a very wealthy tribe. They had, they had stores. They had amassed all of this. They knew metallurgy too. So they were one of the few non-Stone Age populations too. And yet, despite the bribe, the extensive bribe, he's put on trial for a bunch of things, including not being Christian, found guilty, and he is sentenced to die. And he does. Pizarro ends up being ends up torturing and executing Atahualpa, despite all of the bribes he got, and despite, and so it's horrible. First we'll make your life absolutely horrible and kill all your people, and then we'll kill you too after torturing you. And so it was a horrible way to die, for horrible reasons and everything. But in only not even 10 years later, Pizarro ends up being assassinated probably by his own men. So he was not a favorite of anybody. So in some ways, a lot of historians are like, well, he kind of got what he deserved. He was not a good dude, and he had essentially, through his own machinations, had cost many people before this, many Spanish soldiers, their lives. And so this was just, he was just doing a lot of damage until finally someone decided they'd had enough with it. And so he was assassinated. And then, of course, the Mayans, we're not sure exactly why the Mayans kind of died out, but they were definitely surrounded and definitely came into contact in many different ways with Spanish and Portuguese explorers. We just don't exactly, we think the vast majority of them died, and it was disease. not so much. It was through altercations, but still not as many. Now, one thing I do want you to understand too, though, like Jamestown had some skirmishes with different native tribes in the area, and other colonies did too. There were certainly, colonies where they would, shoot natives, or natives would come and attack and take some of the women, or take cattle. That was far more likely that they would steal cattle. And Native American, that kind of unrest continued for many centuries, actually. And there were laws about, what natives could and couldn't do. And there were a lot of church groups, actually, that created, many of them in the Northeast, for instance, like in New Jersey and New York and New Hampshire and stuff like that, who sent people out to the Native American populations in the Midwest and the West, essentially had them sign their children away, brought the children back, and then did exactly what the Canadian schools had done. They cut the children's hair, refused to allow them to speak their own languages, and forced them to practice Christianity, and then returned them as adults, or young adults, back to their tribes when they no longer spoke the language, no longer remembered any of the culture. And it was a hard thing if they survived. Many of those kids died, and the parents never found out what happened to these children. So, but that was very typical. Even in Jamestown, we know that some of the early forts that were built, that if they, for instance, had a run of smallpox or a run of chickenpox, normally they would take garments and bedclothes and stuff like that of the people who had been infected and burn them. What typically happened was, instead of doing that, there was such animosity towards the natives that they would pile them all up, and they'd give them as gifts to the native population. And those natives would accept the gifts, not realizing that they were essentially bringing smallpox or chickenpox into their tribal community. And within weeks, they would all be dead. And for a lot of Europeans, that was seen as, see, that's a sign that they're not, that God doesn't love them. God was willing to let them die of diseases that don't hurt us nearly as much. And so that was, but the problem that arose from that, and it was kind of a problem to do with them being taken as slaves. So many Native Americans were made into slaves at first, and they were the first slaves on in the Mexico and the United States. But these populations didn't handle slavery very well. Remember, they were more likely to die of disease than they were to, or of being whipped to death or something like that. They didn't have the resistance to European illnesses, and so they didn't last very long. Well, what did they do? Well, we need new resources. The Europeans turned to Africa, and primarily because African populations had been exposed to European diseases. They lived alongside them right across the Mediterranean for, of course, thousands of years. And so what happened is the explorers who were going into African regions, primarily Spanish and Portuguese explorers, although Dutch ended up taking over South Africa, and the English had some holdings as well. They paid tribal communities to capture enemy tribes, and those tribal communities delivered the captured people to these slavers. They were thrown onto a boat, usually crowded into it, hundreds and hundreds in a single boat, lying in filth for 3 months while they made the travel over to the New World, and then they were sold as slaves. But they found that the African slaves, because they had resistance, at least resistance to disease, they were able to survive longer as slaves. They were more lucrative in the end. Of course, again, it's the European idea that, well, these populations aren't European and don't speak our language and don't practice Christianity, and so therefore we can do whatever we want to with them. And so they did. So many died just on the voyage over, and yet their treatment as slaves. I mean, people could do anything they wanted to a slave. They could kill it. They could beat a slave to death, and there was no protection. Now, slavery existed throughout the world at this point, but this is the point at which slavery becomes very much racially centered. And so from this point on, the vast majority of the world's slaves will be Native Africans, especially here in the Americas, United States, Canada. Though Canada really didn't have all of slaves. It was far more in Central and South America and in the Caribbean. One thing that happened as well is that once they had been moved over, they were leaving their cultures, leaving their language, leaving everything behind. But once they had gone through a generation, well, all the children that were born of them would be slaves. They would be born into slavery, and then their children as well. And these would become, they essentially, slavery was the only life that for many generations any of them had ever known. And so they lost everything. And and they wouldn't get it back. Even today, the remnants of slavery still exist. And it's mostly in discrimination practices, illegal separation of races, laws that are still in the books that forbid, for instance, interracial marriage or interracial dating, those kinds of things. And even sections of, it's being continued even by the legal system. The legal system does not treat minorities, and especially African Americans, the way that they treat white people. They don't socioeconomically, most Native Americans and Africans and Asian population, anybody who's a minority, they're going to have less of an opportunity to rise up, to earn more money, to get an education, to get health resources or other, resources. So it's a systemic thing, but it comes from this. And this essentially assumption that it was perfectly fine for Europeans to take Africans by force and then force them into slavery. And today, of course, and it became eventually illegal to do this, and yet we're still seeing the effects of it today. So mostly in discrimination and levels of prejudice and violence that will probably continue until all of this stuff is weeded out of society. Now, Asia was a bit different, and we only have a few slides on them, but they're different mainly because, of course, China was advanced compared to Europeans. The Europeans depended on them for silks, for textiles, for china, for porcelain, and for other artistic endeavors. They depended on them for a lot of things that they couldn't make themselves. And so because of that, they did not go to China to subdue the Chinese and take them over and make them into slaves. Instead, they wanted their stuff, and they were willing to pay really good money for it. And so it gave China the upper hand. So there are really only a couple of places within Asia where Chinese populations became, like Hong Kong, for instance, was taken over by the British for the longest time. And so there's several places like that. But a lot of people might even say, well, they were better off with the English than they were being taken over by the other Chinese population. And it certainly isn't to say, if you actually look in the governmental system and the what was systemic culture in China, there's a tremendous amount of prejudice against different groups within Chinese groups. And so, the ones that are in charge are the ones that kind of hold it over others. And definitely they saw different parts of China as inferior. And so it's not like prejudice didn't exist somewhere else. It's not only European. And there is reverse prejudice today too, and reverse discrimination. So humankind tends to be prejudiced. Most of us have a prejudice against something, and I do. I include myself in that. So we don't really. We might be colorblind, or we might be racially sensitive, but we might have other kinds of prejudices as well. It could be ageist or sexist, or maybe you're prejudiced against Democrats or Republicans or people who are political. Who knows? But we do have that. And I don't think any of us are completely bereft of, separated from that way of that. It's a very human way of thinking of us versus them. The other thing that was happening is and both of these, Britain, of course, took control of Hong Kong. Portugal took over India, and India was one of the wealthiest societies at the time. So Portugal took them over mainly, with the interest in trade. And then Britain really took them over, and they took them over through a company. It's one of the weirdest things that the East India Company, which at first was going to trade almost exclusively in tea, rapidly expanded what it was doing, and then eventually it was replaced by the British themselves. The British government took over India's holdings, India's government, India's systems of law, everything. It changed their society dramatically. All of its court systems had, all the legal course cases all had to be, done in English as opposed to Indian. So if suddenly people were minorities in their own country. And when they finally released India from this, and I mean, in 1947 is when India finally gets its full independence. And yet it is now in the bottom third of economies in the world. So, and it's down with many undeveloped countries because, and mostly it's because so many of its natural resources and its other parts of its culture were destroyed, utterly destroyed by Great Britain, or taken for all they could be. So their natural resources, they were essentially made to be an impoverished nation because Britain was taking so much from them that they couldn't sustain themselves. And so it's really horrific, but it's a case study on this is how to destroy another country. By you take it over, but instead of doing any good to it at all, you just sap it for everything that you can. And that in some ways began to happen in the colonies, the American colonies, and yet once Americans realized that Great Britain is only going to take stuff from them and place limits upon them, but not give them anything in return, that's when the colonists said, no, we're not doing that. And of course, they were originally, many of them, British citizens, and they were many the families had come from Britain, but they had more of a sense of, wait a second, this is not okay, and they were able to defeat the British Army and declare independence for the colonies and become the United States. But India would not be able to follow suit until 1947. And at that point, mostly it was through world pressure as well for Britain to let go of these holdings and allow India to govern itself from that point on. But by then, India had been so devastated by what had happened to it that it still has not come close to recovering. Hopefully, at some point, it will. Hopefully. In Japan, this is the most interesting story, and it's the end of our lecture. Japan was fascinating in that they did have extensive trade for early, like in the feudal period and stuff like that. They traded mostly with China. There wasn't a way for Europeans to get to Japan at that point. But then once they did, in fact, they sort of found Japan by accident. They were going to China, the Portuguese were, and their ship was blown off course and landed on the island of Japan, because Japan is not a very large country. It's very small, and it's off the coast of China, and it's just an island. It had a very rich culture. In fact, for hundreds of years, Japanese court was actually to be, the really high up people, to show you were super educated. You spoke Japanese, but you wrote in Chinese. So they had most of their contact with China, but China was seen as so superior and so cool that they kind of, I don't know, they were big fans. They were groupies of China. But after a while, of course, they developed much more solidly their own culture and their own, even the Shintoism, their own religions. And they were very strongly influenced, as China was, by Buddhism. So, but then the Portuguese came in 1543. So 1492, remember that's Columbus. Well, 1543, about 50 years later, a Portuguese trade ship intending to go to China lands in Japan instead. And that very quickly trade with Japan becomes established. Other countries follow suit. They want to trade with Japan as well, because Japan has a lot of textiles and a lot of things that are really cool. Why can't we trade with Japan and make money that way too? And so with that, though, of course, just like they'd done in the Americas and in Australia and in all these other places, they brought Catholicism with them. And several Catholic priests started coming into different Japanese communities. And while they were trading with, stuff, they were also trying to convert people to Catholicism. Well, the Japanese emperor said, nope. He actually stopped. It was 1549, not many years afterwards. Francis Xavier founds a Christian mission. So they're actually building a mission church for, kind of as a headquarters for their Christian advancement within Japan. And the regent and then the next emperor grow furious with this, and they say you need to get out. And by 1639, so less than 100 years later, they say everybody gets out. And the only people who are allowed to trade with them from this point on, and they can only come to the docks, do trade, and then leave, are the Dutch. And with the understanding that the Dutch by this point are pretty much all Protestant, they're not Catholics, but with the understanding that no religious anything will be exchanged. So they are not allowed to try to further Lutheranism or anything like that, any Protestant faith, through their trade. It can only be trade, and it's strict, and it remains strict until the 20th century. So for like the next 350 years, no one gets to trade with Japan, and Japan is essentially cut off from the rest of the world except for the Dutch traders. That's it. And so that's it. Eventually they open back up again, and everybody goes, oh, then people are really cool. They think Japan is awesome because they're so different culturally from everybody else in the world, because they've grown on their own for 300 years plus. It's amazing what happens when you're isolated. What you wonder how cultures will transform when not influenced by other cultures. Well, that's what happened to Japan. So if you're interested in studying something like that, just let me know, and I'll see what I can do to find you some good resources for that. But that's the end of this. So we kind of see overall the effects on the natives were not so great. In fact, they were pretty horrible. Lots and lots of people died of disease, or were killed, or were put into slavery and died that way. Whole populations from Africa were transported, and that would continue until the slave trade became illegal. And at that point still, though, breeding slaves was perfectly legal in the United States and elsewhere. And so that's, honestly, from the time that transporting slaves became no longer legal here in the United States, the number of slaves quadrupled over the next 50 years, because they were still breeding the slaves and keeping them as slaves until slavery would eventually become illegal. And we're still suffering the effects of it, though. So keep this in mind as you go through. Let me know if you have questions in your journals once you've read the chapter and watch this in its entirety. See y'all later.